Welcome to the latest episode of Sports Bazaar and what could be, at least for our main season, our last two-parter.
We should wrap this up in 2 episodes. And it should be, they'll take us out for the year.
For the year. Apart from your very exciting summer series, are we allowed to mention that at this stage?
Well, the members know, but for the general population, we're going to finish up around November 27 for our normal episodes.
Yes.
Just for a break over summer.
Yeah.
Where there'll still be more bonus episodes for the members. So if you're not a member, you can join up. But then also, I'm happy to announce we're going to have a bunch of interviews I'm going to do over summer, which I've recorded some already. They're great. They're interesting people.
Do you need any help writing those? Or do you want me to cover
Everyone
them?
knows that you secretly write the scripts.
Yeah.
Everyone knows this. And
good luck on your own. It'd be good to see, if you can just step up and take the reins.
It is a lot of work. I hadn't realised how much work it is.
All right, but this is our main game, right?
Yes, and this is, before we announce what topic we're doing, this is one of the ones that was voted for by the members. So if you are a member, we put up a couple of, we put up this one and the Malice at the Palace, which is the brawl in the NBA.
Yeah. And
this just beat it.
It went down to the wire.
It did a very close poll. I think it was like 3 votes in the end separated them.
Yeah.
So we're doing Keith Miller, the famous Australian cricketer.
Yes.
If you're not from Australia or one of the
England or
India, one of the cricket nations, he is one of the great characters of all time. Despite the cricket, was on top of his cricket. So,
on and off the field.
On and off
larger
the field.
than life. And, left a trail.
Trail of
destruction and wonder.
So, let's kick off. Keith Ross Miller was born on the 28th of November 1919. So the war's just
post-First War baby. He's a First World War baby boomer.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And he's born in the Melbourne suburb of Sunshine. So he's born in Melbourne, Victoria.
For anyone who doesn't know, it's ironically named.
It is not the
Sunshine is not that.
I think then it would have been more bush than anything.
Working like poverty addled, or
he wasn't that poor. He wasn't super rich either. So, and he was the youngest of 4 children. So he had 2 older brothers and 1 older sister.
Yeah.
And he's named Keith Ross Miller because at the time he's being born, Keith Smith and Ross Smith, who are famous aviators, were halfway through their flight from London, the first ever flight from London to Australia that was ever completed, which was a record. It took them 27 days and 20 hours. And so his parents decided to name him after both of them, Keith and Ross, and so they named him Keith Ross Miller. Luckily, the plane made it. It would be a haunting thing to be named the rest of your life.
Yeah, know what you're named after? Those dead pilots.
Those failures that didn't make it. But they did make it. So now the 3 Miller boys all played Australian rules football in the winter.
Yep.
And they would then play cricket in the summer, which was pretty common back then in Australia. They were the 2 major sports. So they all played cricket. His dad was a great cricketer, not like a great club cricketer. And so he taught all the boys how to bat, very good on technique. And they all loved Bill Ponsford, who was a famous batsman. They've a stand at the Melbourne Cricket Grounds named after.
Yes.
You'd have spent many a day in the Ponsford stand.
I have.
As have I.
It's my natural habitat. We need to point out too that at that time in Australia, that was how boys played sport. Cricket in the summer, football, whatever code, in the winter.
Yeah.
And that was it. There was just nothing else on the table.
No other sports. In the southern states, you played Australian rules football. In the northern states, you played rugby league. And the football sports were seen as they began to keep cricketers fit.
Healthy in the
cricketers never got fit until about the 2000s,
right.
but anyway.
Well done, Booney.
So at the age of 7, they moved to Elstonwick, which is in Melbourne's southwest, much more inner city sort of place. He was living in a place it was a street called Denver Crescent, the neighbours kept complaining because he would get his sister's stocking, put a cricket ball in it, tie the stocking to the roof, and then just hit the ball all day, right? Yeah. So he was obsessed with cricket, the whole family was. Yeah. So he was doing that sort of thing. They had a neighbour The neighbours would complain about the noise. He had a neighbour that whenever they hit a ball over the fence, would pinch the ball, never give it back. They reckon he had like 1,000 balls from these boys playing in the backyard. Now he's very small for his
Really?
age. I'm about to say small for his size. Yeah, Miller is very small. Like, he's well below. Everyone comments on him being just a really small kid.
Okay.
And this kind of makes him have to focus when he plays cricket on his technique, because
Right.
he's got no real strength. He's up against much bigger boys. He's
Needs
not real
to marshal all his skills.
skill. Yeah, it's all skill, and even bowling, he's having to like bowl spin. He's just
Crikey.
not big enough to have any impact on the game. Loves football, but too small to really have any impact. So this is what he grows up like. Now, one of the reasons he says that at the age of 12, he thought that it would be better for him to become a jockey, and starts training to be a jockey.
Really?
Yeah. So he's going to Caulfield Racecourse, training on horses. He goes to the Melbourne Cup, which is, the big race in Melbourne. As you know, he's awed by that and thinks, given my height and weight, a jockey is a career for me.
So he's really got himself set on doing something in sport.
His sport's
so
mad.
This is it.
Yeah. And he thinks cricket's beyond me. I'm not going to be big enough, and football's definitely beyond me. So but he still plays them, but he realises he's not going to make it to the top. He says one of the reasons he thinks he wasn't that big, he starts to wonder at the age of 12 if his fact that he started smoking is stunting his growth.
Wow.
So
those were the days.
So he's at that
Did he
age.
smoke around the house, like at the table?
I think
in
he
front
will.
of the parents?
No,
Right.
he said it was sneaky. He said he'd started smoking. He said he was from about the age of 10. He smoked like a chimney. It is a different age.
There it is.
And Miller.
Well, I think they were still suggesting smoking was good for you.
This is sort of, this is in the 1920s, so it's like 1920s, 1930s, so it's still well before. So he said, but sometimes he said, this is key, he said, sometimes one of my elders would catch me and warn me that would stunt my growth. I took no notice, he said. Then I smoked my first cigar and was sick for 3 days. I've never smoked since. So he stopped smoking at a thing, but he still was very small, and he was also quite relatively weak for boys his age.
Sure.
So he didn't have a lot going for him. He went to Elston State School, but he managed to get into Melbourne High, which is, as you know, a select entry school.
Sure.
So you have to get very good marks to get into it. So he was obviously bright.
Yep.
And so he gets into Melbourne High. And this becomes interesting for him because at Melbourne High School, his maths teacher and his cricket teacher on the thing is the former Australian captain Bill Woodfull, who was a great player,
Sure.
captain of Australia in cricket, had only just retired. So he suddenly got the ex-captain of Australia coaching him. And Woodfull was also captain of the Carlton Cricket Club and the state of Victoria too. So, and only just left playing for Australia. So
It's
pretty good.
Handyman to have.
A handyman.
Access to,
So also Woodfull had been Ponsford's batting partner. So this was sort of a hero worship thing for Miller. Like he was someone who knew it. So Miller, age 14, he is selected for the school's first 11 in cricket. In his first game, he scores 44. And so it's obvious he's got all the raw talent in a technique sense, right? Everyone starts to say, this kid's actually, despite his size, is pretty good. The captain of his school cricket team was a guy called Keith Bluey Truscott, who would know. He went on to play for the Melbourne Football Club. He played cricket at quite a high level. He went on in the war, World War II. He was a fighter pilot. He was an ace. He had 20 confirmed victories and 5 unconfirmed victories. That he'd later be killed while flying during the war. Yes. Which comes to impact Keith. All these people he grew up with, a lot of them don't make it through World War II. And we'll get more into that as his outlook on life. Keith is playing cricket, football, and is training to be a jockey. So in year 9, in 1934, he doesn't pass a single one of his 8 subjects at school. English, algebra, geometry, all fails. Physics he fails, chemistry fails, drawing, history and French. His average mark was 25%. He scored a 0 in his final term exam in geometry, which
0?
Yeah, which Woodfull, who was his teacher, was furious with him.
Yeah.
He finished bottom of his class of 40 students and was forced to repeat the year.
Okay.
Now, Keith is, by this point, he's given up the smoking, but he loves socialising, hanging out. He's a gregarious guy, right? Young kid, 14, but everyone sort of likes him. He's charismatic. Miller's captain, though, Keith Truscott, Bluey Truscott, takes him for a trial for local club side St Kilda at the start of the 34-35 season in cricket, this is. Now, cricket, you got to remember, at this point, cricket at a club level in Australia, incredibly strong.
Yes.
You know, there wasn't this global sport as much. So you played for the club, then you hope to get into the state team for Victoria or New South Wales or whatever, into Sheffield Shield it was called, and then you hope to get into international. And so the local media covered the club.
Absolutely.
And in every club you usually had a couple of former internationals or Victorian state players, so it was a real tough thing to get into. So he goes down there and Keith Truscott takes him down, Blue Truscott takes him down. Miller couldn't get into any of the 5 teams. So they had 5 senior teams from the first through the 5th. He couldn't cut it in any of them. And then one day at the nets, he's bowling to one of the best batsmen at St Kilda. And the batsman gets frustrated and said, "Son, take that ball and hand it to someone who can bowl," because he was so bad at bowling. And Keith said, "I had to point out to this exasperated senior that there was no one around beside the 2 of us." He said, "Frankly, I did not blame him for that time. I had no idea how to bowl." And so he basically is done at St Kilda before he even starts. He's about 15 at this point. He joins the local sub-district cricket, which is much lower level, Elstonwick. He doesn't get to bat or bowl in his first match. And then he's dropped for the second match because they say he's a poor fielder.
This is not good.
So this is not good.
He's not off to a flyer.
He's not off for a flyer. So luckily for him, there's a former Victorian state player called Hughie Carroll who becomes a bit of a mentor to Miller. And he sees Miller's talent at one game and thinks, I actually think this kid could be good. Yeah. I actually think he's got something to him. So he says, come to South Melbourne, which is a big rival of St Kilda's. And there at South Melbourne, Miller meets a guy called Ian Johnson and another guy called Lindsay Hassett, who both go on to become his Australian captains for him later in the year. Later in his life. And also at the club was Laurie Nash, who was a champion footballer, whose name you would know. He's in the Hall of Fame for football. He'd played Test cricket against South Africa, and he was a really good Aussie rules player. So he had these amazing sports people around him. Sure. Miller scores 12 not out on debut for South Melbourne, but observers feel that he's not strong enough. And Hugh Carroll, his mentor and the club coach, says he was so small he had to be careful not to tread on him. They decide to measure...
How old is he here?
14, 15.
14, 15.
And he's tiny, right? And his technique is so good that they all think there's something here, but they're all like, he can't hit sixes, he can't hit to the boundary very much. There's no big hits. If you're not a cricket fan and you maybe get baseball, it's all singles, not... He's not hitting home runs, right? Like he's not a power hitter. But they all think he's good enough. They measure him and they realise he's so short, they actually give him a cut-down bat. So they basically give him a much smaller bat. And they also get him to bowl. He's mucking around bowling spin. They get him to bowl really slow to get accuracy. He wants to bowl fast, but they're like, no, you need to get your accuracy. You can't. You're just not strong enough.
Jeez.
So he's playing for them, and he's like, he's going okay, but he's young. They see him as a future prospect. And in South Melbourne's final game of the 1934-35 season, he plays against Carlton, and that's the club that Bill Woodfull, his maths teacher and former Australian captain, he captains Carlton. And Keith decides, well, I'm keen to do well against his side to at least impress him because I've just failed year 9. He's not happy with me. I want to show him that I can at least...
I got a 0. I don't want to duck out here.
Yeah, I can at least play cricket. South Melbourne bat first, and they collapse. At one stage, they're 5 wickets for 6 runs, which for those uninitiated, you're trying to get between 200 to 400 runs in a test inning. So being 5 for 6, it's so bad that the reporter at the ground, a guy called Percy Millard, he phones the Melbourne Herald, who he works for, and says, "Send a photographer down. We're about to see one of the lowest scores in club cricket in history." Barely anyone gets below 50 in club cricket as a team. So they're all like, this is on. This is an abject disaster. Miller, finally, it's his turn to bat, and South Melbourne have had a bit of a recovery. They're now 5 for 32 runs. Still pretty bad, though. Miller comes out, and standing at mid-off, very close in fielding, is his maths teacher, Woodfull. And he's like, I could just tell Woodfull was like, I'm going to get this kid out. Yeah. Right, we're going to get him out. So there's this huge amount of pressure on him. 3 more wickets fall. Miller is still in. South reach 9 for 76. Miller is on 18 not out. So he's resurrected them a bit to look okay, but it's
rearguard action.
It's a rearguard action. It's terrible. A guy called Snowy Davidson, which is a great name. No one's called Snowy anymore.
Snowy's a great name.
Yeah. He joins him, and he's like the worst. He's a bowler. So he can't bat at all. He's just there to make up the numbers. He's the last wicket. And the spectators are watching going, there's this undersized tiny kid whose batting pads come up to his hips with a cut-down bat. And there's this guy who cannot bat at all, and they are in real trouble. They managed to make a partnership of 65 in 95 minutes, almost all of them Miller's runs. They lift South to a more respect to 141. And finally, Miller goes out. The entire crowd, he scored 61 runs. The entire crowd rises as he strolls off, and the photographer is there and takes a photo of this moment. And they all applaud because it's just, it's not that it's the highest score ever, but it's just the pressure he was under, how little he is, the unlikeliness. He saved the face of the club. Yeah. Millard, the reporter, wrote, "A Ponsford in miniature describes Miller. He has all the strokes, courage and artistry. All he needs, apart from experience, is power in his shots, particularly his drives. Running between the wickets, Miller looked all legs and pads. His bat is the smallest in the district." The paper the next day puts a photo of his bat next to a normal size bat to show how small it is. He continued writing, "Discovered and coached by Huey Carroll, Miller, who possesses cricket brains and temperament, had developed to the extent that already the Southerners acclaim him as a future test batsman for Australia." So this is huge praise.
Okay.
Carlton go on and win the next Saturday when they get their turn to bat. But they present Miller with a silver egg cup for sterling performance, which is rare for the opposition to give you that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Woodfull presents it to him in algebra class.
Which to make him turn up.
Yeah, exactly. So the next year he does pull himself together academically, and the second time he does year 9, he doesn't shoot the lights out, but he's okay.
Yeah.
And in year 10 he does okay too. So he starts to get his academic stuff underneath. But at 17 years of age, Miller is he's 150 centimetres tall, or 4.9 feet. Pretty short. Oh, yeah. Less than 5 foot tall.
It's not good.
And he's 17, right? So this is the one thing that everyone thinks is probably
stop him taking his place at the top end.
Yeah.
Oh well.
At 17 years of age, he suddenly has a huge growth spurt.
Hello.
He grows 28 centimetres.
That's
or
the
11,
Keith Miller I know.
Or 11 inches in 1 year.
How is that?
He goes from being under 5 foot, 4.9 feet, to 6.1 feet tall, or 185 centimetres. So he ends up about 6'2". Now you got to remember, in 1930, 6'2" is tall.
It's big.
Nowadays it's like still pretty tall, but then it's
a big guy.
You're a big guy, right? Miller said this thwarted his career as a jockey. It's
a sad moment.
Because suddenly he's like gone from being the smallest guy at school to one of the biggest.
Yeah.
Right? Several things happen for Miller with this. So one is, which is kind of interesting in his psychology, throughout his entire life, he's grown up to the age of 17 being the underdog and the small one.
Yes.
The one boys picked on occasionally. So he always has this underdog, almost small man syndrome.
Yeah, and street smarts, and he had to survive and be quick on his wits and all of the stuff that you need.
And charm.
When you have no natural advantage.
Exactly. And his batting is flawless in a technique sense. His bowling, he's learnt to bowl without the raw... if you just have raw power, you probably don't need to learn all that technique. But he's learnt all that, but now he's suddenly in a 6'1" frame, and he's filling out. He also suddenly goes from being like the little guy to this tall guy, and he's described all through the contemporary records throughout his career as being incredibly good looking. So like they call him a matinee looks, they say. They call him the Errol Flynn of cricket. They call him the Casanova of the crease. Women are just...
They lose their minds.
They lose their minds. He's like full, like almost Beatles mania before there's the Beatles, right?
So the phrase I like to use is a good-looking rooster.
A good-looking rooster.
He was, and charming to boot. So he's got these incredible movie star looks. And a charming charismatic persona.
Yeah.
He is the complete package.
He's a complete package. Guys want to hang out with him and muck around with him.
Girls
Women want to be with him. Like anywhere he goes, he's just the center of attention the minute he walks in.
There's only a few of us who can say that. You know what I mean?
I don't know what you mean. It's definitely not me. I know you do, but I don't. Suddenly, with his increased height and weight and looks and everything going in, he's begins to play football and he suddenly can be physical and aggressive.
Yeah.
So he goes from being like hidden in the back pocket to suddenly like a really good footballer. And suddenly his cricket strokes are like huge. He's hitting sixes, he's hitting fours. He's got all the technique.
Thumping boundaries.
But now he has huge power. And so he becomes so good. This growth spurt shows a lot of things. While still at school, he's picked for Victoria's second 11, so their second team.
Yes.
So he's representing the state, not at the very top level, but at their second,
and
their
how old
reserve
is he?
team. He's 17 at this age, right?
So, yeah.
At the same time, he is with this growth spurt. In 1936, he's voted Melbourne High's sports champion. He's got a batting average of 86. He had 13 wickets for the season. He's suddenly looking quite good. Woodfull writes in the school magazine The Unicorn, Miller has test possibilities. As in he could play for Australia.
Is he bowling fast yet?
No, he's barely bowling. He bowls very sparingly. He's not a bowler, he's a batsman at this stage.
Right.
So, and no one thinks of him ever being a bowler at this stage. This is a huge thing that Woodfull says he could play Test cricket. This really puts him on the radar. But he also decides that he's had enough of school, and at the end of year 10, he quits.
He's on the verge of academic greatness.
And it's partly this is his personality. Also, back then, a lot of people, they just didn't... Finishing school wasn't as big a deal, you know. So he goes and works for a company called Vacuum Oil Co., which is a forerunner to Mobile Oil. He's a clerk. He's basically working in finance and accounting departments, stamping and organising invoices. Incredibly boring work. Yet the reason he goes there is they agree that they'll accommodate all his first-class cricket. Right. They see him as a future star. Now, his boss, his manager, is a guy called Percy Beams, who is also a state cricketer and played football for Melbourne, and you would know his name as there is a Percy Beams bar.
Correct.
At the Melbourne Football Club in the members. You would have drunk.
I'm going, where do I know that
It's
name?
a great bar.
Percy Beams bar. Absolutely.
It's a great bar. It's on the third level looking down on everything.
It's fantastic.
So Percy Beams is
you know what that bar's full of?
Private school kids.
Yeah, the disappointing son. Someone like captains of industry have got a number of kids.
Yeah.
And most of them would have gone on to take over the business, but then you've got the one son who just likes a drink.
Yeah. Like spend the money
and goes to the footy.
Yeah.
That's the Percy Beams bar.
That's a lot of my
Big
friends.
Big hello to everyone down there. By the way,
they're pretty much all my
look
friends.
Forward to a warm welcome next time I'm
there. I'd say. So Percy Beams, who plays for Melbourne Football Club and plays for Victorian Cricket, he's his new boss. So he's got this enormous leeway to, like, if he needs to go and play cricket for a week or training or whatever, it's like fine. You got to remember, cricket and football don't pay any money at this point, so you need a job. So in 1937 and the 38 season, he starts playing for the Victorian. He's still playing for the Victorian second 11, and he has an innings of 181 runs against Tasmania, which leads to his promotion.
It has to be.
At 18 years old to play for he's 18 years old to play for Victoria.
Brilliant.
In his fourth match, he scores 108 against South Australia, which some of the best Test match bowlers were playing for them.
Yes.
Bradman is playing in the same game and had scored 267. So Don Bradman, for those that don't know, not cricket fans, the Babe Ruth of cricket, the Michael Jordan of
to ever play
cricket.
the game.
And arguably, and I've seen it, like even American people have argued this in things, if you look at his stats, he is further ahead of all his contemporaries and all current players on statistically more than Jordan was, more than LeBron is, more than Babe Ruth was. So his batting record is famously just below 100 runs a game. The next is normally in like the 50s. At this point, his sporting career is completely overturned by World War II, which is...
What a rude interruption.
Rude interruption.
The worst timing.
It was like for some, this is it was just for him, it was just, he was about to break out.
This was going to be it.
And so he is suddenly, in Australia, because they were very much still part of the British Empire at this point, and really saw themselves as British, he signs up, he joins the Army Reserve. He's assigned to the 4th Reserve Motor Transport Company, and he has to start reporting for training. Now, Miller has always been a nonconformist.
Yes.
He does not take orders well, and he likes to have fun. Yeah. And so suddenly he's having clashes with authority. The army is really a very bad place for Keith Miller in many ways.
It's not ideal for him.
He loves a drink. He loves women. He's tall and good looking. He's physically strong, so he's not scared of anyone. He hates bullies or authority because he's got this underdog mentality.
And there's a bit of that going on.
And he's suddenly working for the army. But so he soon gets a nickname, Dusty. That becomes his nickname, known for his ability to, for fist fights. So he's suddenly in the army, he's getting fights regularly and things like that, right? He's granted leave, though, to go play interstate cricket because despite the war going on, they haven't yet cancelled cricket to keep the morale up. And he starts playing very well. And it's this point they give him a few chances to bowl. And he plays one game and Bradman's playing against him and he sees him bowl. He takes 1 wicket for 24 in 6 overs. But his pace and lift is so impressive. Bradman notes, I reckon this guy could actually bowl as well, and just puts it in the back of his head. He plays the 941 VFL Season 2 while the war's going on and while he's in the Army Reserve. He plays in defence and attack. He plays 16 games. He kicks 28 goals. He kicks 8 in one match. This shows you how good he is. In one game, he's playing Melbourne. He strikes his boss, Percy Beams, with a raised elbow at the start of the match. So there's his manager.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Percy doesn't hold any grudges. Keith says, St Kilda must have been pretty weak at that time because I played full-back, centre-half back, centre half forward and full forward for them. He comes second in their best and fairest for the season. But his season has also been cut short. He's recalled to duty. He continues to get discipline problems, and he's asked to leave the Army Reserve on the 8th of November 1941.
There you go.
So
During wartime.
We're
going to have to ask you to leave.
Yeah.
It's all hands on deck. Not you.
You're out. So he and his friend, they decide, why don't we join the Navy? Navy might be more our style. So they go down to the Navy office and Miller is accepted. And then they do physical and look at all your forms and stuff. And his friend is not accepted. And so Miller says, well, if you're not taking my mate, I'm not joining, and rips up the form in front of the officer. Storms out and goes around the corner to the Royal Australian Air Force recruiting office, and he enlists to them. He has to wait a little while, but in early 1942, this is after Pearl Harbor has happened, he's called up. He's sent to the number 4 initial training school in Victor Harbor for South Australia.
Yes.
He says was incredibly boring. He looked forward to weekend leave, which only came once a month. So most of the time he's just on this army base in South Australia bored. They had a drill instructor who's redheaded, so they called him Sergeant Bluey. And he was known to often just cancel leave if people did anything. If they mucked up on the drill field, any disciplinary action. So they were all very nervous of him because they didn't want their leave cancelled.
It's a reign of terror.
It's a reign of terror. They hell hated this guy. They did a normal rifle drill, and then the sergeant at the end, he says, they're doing all the bayonets, they're doing all rifle drills and stuff. And then at the end, he says, I want one of you trainees to volunteer, and you've got to try and disarm me of my rifle. And everyone stands there going, no way, because we don't want to get our leave cancelled.
I'm not falling for that.
And he says, come on, you have to do it. I need a volunteer. One of you got to do it. And they're all just standing there. And then he keeps yelling at them. And finally a voice speaks up and goes, I'll do it. And it's Miller. And Miller steps forward and he says, now, I'm reminding you, he says to the sergeant, you promised no matter what happens, you're not cancelling our weekend leave. And the sergeant goes, absolutely not. Yeah. So they start to circle each other. Miller grabs him with one hand, trips him with one of his foot, while with his other hand ripping the rifle off him. The sergeant ends up on the ground. Because Miller is this huge, very strong, very coordinated athlete.
Champion.
Who likes fighting.
Yeah.
So the sergeant's suddenly on the ground and yells at Miller, you tripped me. And he said, I disarmed you, didn't I, Sergeant?
That's the point.
Yeah. Sergeant Bluey gets back up, grabs his rifle, and he says, all right, do it again. So Miller goes, well, you promised me you're not going to cancel my leave. He goes, no. So they start circling again, and straight again, Miller grabs him, trips him, and rips the rifle off him. And this time he puts his heavy-duty boot on the sergeant's clean shirt and leaves a mark. The instructor jumps up and goes, your weekend leave is cancelled, Miller. You're on guard duty. And the whole recruits all say, that's not fair, Sergeant. He says, shut up or I'll cancel the rest of your leave. And so Miller says, well, this is no good. And so he appeals to the camp officer who runs the camp. And he's summoned to the guy who heads up the camp to his room with the sergeants there as well. And the sergeant tells the officer what happened. And the officer looks at the sergeant and Miller and says, I don't think it matters how you were disarmed, Sergeant. And he said, I'm not too concerned about your boot touch the sergeant's shirt either. Like, who cares? And so he gave the instructor a dressing down, put him on guard duty and told Miller he's free to go.
Oh, I love a happy ending.
So after this, Miller is sent to America for further training. Right. And he's going to be learning how to fly and all this sort of stuff. And he's drinking with a mate, Bill Young, who's a guy from Broken Hill, whose nickname is Pissy, because he likes to get drunk. And at the bar of the Boston Avery Hotel, and standing next to them is a man, and he's drinking a dry martini with an olive in it. Yeah. Now, Miller and Bill Young have never seen a martini, right? They come from Australia's a backwater, really, at this point. It's beer and maybe wine. And so they go, and rum, so they go, what's that? And the man says, he starts to explain the soaked olive and what a martini is. So they order a martini with him, and they're getting along like a house on fire with this guy.
Pissy will be loving this.
Yeah. They're and Miller is gregarious, charming. So
absolutely.
The guy says, I notice you got Australian badges. They say we're with the RAAF, the Air Force for Australia. We're en route to the UK. And the man's name's Carl Wagner, and he's a stockbroker and from a very rich Boston family. And he says, my wife is from Hull in Yorkshire, you're going over there. He says, why don't you come home with me and have a few more drinks and meet her and hang out? Wow. And so they come back, and he's got this huge house. They live on a 27-acre property. That's how rich they are. Yeah. And Miller meets Carl's 25-year-old daughter, Peg.
Oh dear.
Who's a secretary at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and she admires him straight away because he's a very good-looking man and very charming. And they basically hook up. and in the next 3 weeks, he hangs out with her before he's about to ship off to the UK. Yes. And they fall in love, and he proposes to her, and she says yes.
Wow.
And then he takes off to England for the war.
Do they get married?
We'll get to that. Yeah, okay. It's a long way down the track, but because he's got to go fight a war.
But not by the time he's left.
No. So he turns up in Britain.
But hang on, but they're engaged?
They're engaged, so he's now engaged.
Well, so he's spoken for.
He is spoken for, and can I just say, he's deployed to Bournemouth in England, and within 2 minutes he has a girlfriend.
Yeah, thought so.
And he's got girlfriends on girlfriends.
Keith. Yeah, let's just get that out
Keith
there.
Miller's son said after his death that his dad was no angel and made Shane Warne look tame. So Keith Miller, you got to remember, Keith Miller exists in a time where the reporters did not report on affairs. It was really just not the done thing. So he was every night pretty much going out with different women. Yes. He had a black book. He had girlfriends in every town.
Okay.
So yeah, Faith.
He's living the dream.
He's
for a young man, good-looking rooster.
Yeah, and he does not let the fact that he's on cricket tour with no one, and there's pre-internet, pre-everything. Word doesn't get around like it does. Would now you'd have hurt. Is
that fair?
So he is deployed to Bournemouth in England, where he's training, and this is where they're really starting to do real serious flying. He becomes friends with a guy called he's an English guy, Gus Glendinning, and Gus was a medium height guy. And one quiet afternoon, they're in the mess. Miller's not in there, and there's 4 aircrew playing cards and reading books and drinking beer at the bar. And then one of the guys is a big guy. He's on a losing streak and he's getting nasty. And so he yells at Gus, "Go upstairs and get my pack of cards from the cupboard of my room." And then the game continues and Gus hasn't done it. Yeah. He turns to Gus and says, "If you don't get the cards, I'll knock your block off." And Gus is not that big a guy, and this guy's huge. But Miller just happens to walk in at this point. And Miller walks straight up to the guy and says, "If you ever lay a hand on him, I'll break your bloody neck." And so Gus says, "I suddenly realised I had at least one mate in the Air Force." The big guy backs down immediately because Miller has a reputation of going off. He does officer training and he's sent on a Royal Navy destroyer as part of an exchange program. And while they're attacked by a German U-boat. He manages to survive and they sink the U-boat, but he's just having...
these close calls.
Constantly.
It's around him.
It's around him. In March 1945, Miller is deployed to the RAF station in Great Massingham in Norfolk, and he's assigned to the 169 Squadron flying Mosquito fighter bombers. And so he starts taking part in missions. He's targeting mainland Europe. They're attacking the V1 and the V2, the giant missiles that the Nazis have built. Mm-hmm. They're attacking those test sites. Another night, when he was coming back from an operation in France, he misjudged the landing and almost crashes it. And this is where his back starts to get very stuffed, which will affect his cricket in the future. When he crashed the plane and rode off the plane in one of the accidents on a crash landing, he got out and the ground crew rush up and he says to the ground crew as he gets out of the plane, "Nearly stumps drawn that time, gents." An hour later, he's playing soccer with his mates. Another time, Miller and his friend Gus Glendinning are asked to test a plane together. They're drinking, but they've been drinking at a lunch. They're really drunk. Rather than not take it out, neither wants the other to fly it. One's going to be a passenger, one's going to fly a flight. They're both going, "You're too drunk, I'll fly." And the other one goes, "No, you are, I'll drive." They're both probably pretty drunk. So they flip a coin for it. Gus gets to fly. Miller urges him on as Glendinning flies on the coast and he buzzes a beach 100 feet or 30 metres above the beach, causing sunbathers to run for cover. They're just doing this for fun. They do a few low swoops like this and then fly back to their base. In the mess that night, the squadron leader comes in and says, I was at the beach. Who of you were buzzing the beach? And he said, and they all deny. And he asked Glendinning and Miller, who are the most likely targets. They go, "Not us, sir." And he said, "We couldn't get the marking, but the plane did look like one of ours." And then he paused and looked at Gus and says, "You sure it wasn't you, Glendinning?" And Glenning says, I swear to God it wasn't me. And the commanding officer goes, well, don't do it again, and walks out. Miller once
what
also...
a time.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
and this is
behaving like adults and sorting it out in the way it should be sorted out.
Well, these guys have all lost heaps of mates. They've gone through absolute hell. They know what real... And the war has ended in Europe at this point. But the thing that's hanging over all this is it's a very big chance Miller's going to be sent to fight the Japanese. Yep. So the war in Japan, you've got to remember, they don't know about nuclear bombs that are coming. They don't know any of this. So they are like, there is a real sense that we might not be alive next week, right? Miller once also buzzed Royal Ascot Racecourse and was reprimanded by his commanding officer, calling him an utter disgrace to the Air Force. Despite all this, Wing Commander Neville Reeves said of Keith as a pilot, he was one of my finest, perhaps the bravest and most willing I had under my command. He wouldn't be alive today, but for what we all came to know as Miller's luck. He kept taking the most fantastic risks, and they all came off.
Yep.
Now, during the war, Miller has been allowed to play cricket off and on, when there was time. And for morale, they encourage this, especially against, they're usually military teams. Yep. So it'd be Air Force versus something else, things like that. He met at this point in a match between the Dominions, so all the Australia, South Africa, the colonies, against an English representative side. He meets a batsman by the name of Dennis Compton, who goes on to be very famous for England. Compton is basically an English version of Miller. He played for Arsenal in football, a fantastic winger, and he played for England in 75 tests. So he is like Miller, is physically gifted. Yeah. He's also a massive ladies' man. He's married 3 times in his life, and he's a massive drinker. And him and Miller go on to become absolute best of friends. But the first time, Compton is also known for being incredibly absent-minded. It was legendary. He just didn't pay attention to anything. He once turned up at an Old Trafford test against South Africa. This is after the war. He'd forgotten his kit bag with all these bats and everything. Yeah. So he's got no bat, and everyone's like, what are you going to do? So he sauntered into the Old Trafford, had a museum. So he goes in there and gets an antique bat off the display. And he goes on to score 158 runs in the first innings and 71 in the second, and then puts the bat back in the museum.
Everything about this is wonderful.
So Compton, in his first time, he hasn't met Miller at this point, and he's batting, and he's doing very well. And Miller, he's about to face Miller.
There's still wartime.
There's still wartime. This is the RAF versus a local team. This is the Dominions versus an English representative side. And Compton has not met Miller, and Miller is going to bowl. Now, Miller's not a bowler at this stage. He's a batsman. Yeah. So Compton watches him and says Miller doesn't mark his run, like they mark their run in. He doesn't do that. He just saunters out to some point. He doesn't even roll his arm over to warm up or anything, right? Yeah. So Compton likes, who this guy? So he turns to the Dominions keeper, Stan Sizeme, so the opposition, but says, what does this fellow do? What sort of bowler is he? And somebody says, he's not really a bowler, he just chances his arm, which is true. Yeah. So he's not trying to game him. It's true. Dennis is not known. Miller is not known as a bowler at this stage. So Miller comes in off 8 paces, which is very short for a delivery, and he's down the first delivery. And Compton says, I am pretty calm because I just think, he says, so I'm rather nonchalant when I take guard. I'm thinking, okay, this guy's not really thinking. He says he takes this short run up, lets go the ball, and Compton says, my hand stands on end. This is the fastest ball I've faced since I played Australia's Ernie McCormack at 9:38. The ball goes for 4 byes over my left shoulder and past Stan standing on the wicket. So I do meet Keith Miller. Now, the war's made Keith worry less about cricket because so many of his mates have died and all this. Michael Parkinson, when interviewing him years later, says, how did you handle the pressure in cricket? And Miller famously responded, pressure is a Messerschmitt up your ass. Playing cricket is not. Correct. Which is his famous quote. One example of this more casual approach to cricket came when, in the final days of the Australian service team playing Nottinghamshire at Trent Bridge, it became obvious that no result could be obtained. It was a bit boring. And Keith had his third batting partner come out. Keith was batting and doing quite well. And he said to him, "This is all getting bloody boring. Let's have some fun." And his partner says, "How?" He says, "When we run, well, we'll call yes when we mean no, and vice versa. We'll completely bamboozle the fieldsman." And so they do this for a while. They score 34 runs, while when they're going to take a run, they say no. When they're going to not take a run, they say yes. Then Keith called no when he actually means no. And his unfortunate partner was left stranded mid-pitch. And Keith says, "Oh, well, it was fun while it lasted." So this is his new attitude. He loves playing. Another one is, this gives you an idea of how crazy it was. One time, this is where he's got this view of life is stupid. One time he's actually playing at Lord's, and he reaches his century, and at the moment he reaches century, a V1 flying bomb lands just nearby. Wow. This is a bit earlier. Yes. So he's like, I could die. I could have died 1,000 times.
It's coming.
So he takes none of it very seriously. One time he's playing against a guy who's an accurate new ball bowler. He's an army. They're all still in the army, all these guys. He's an army colonel called J.W.A. Stevenson, and he beats Keith with an all ends up sort of a leg cutter. Doesn't hit the wicket, but he's clearly beaten. And so he says, "That was a good one, Keith?" And Keith comes out walks towards him and pats the spot where the ball landed with the bat, tosses back his hair and just grins at him. And so Stevenson said, "I bowled him an almost identical ball the next one. He pull drove it across the full flight of the tower on the tavern, narrowly missing the clock, and smiled and called back, 'That was an even better one, huh, Colonel?'" So the war is over. Keith is in England, and we might leave it here, but to set up the next stage, what is about to be played is a series of tests. The war in Japan is still going on, but they decide, the Australians and the English, we're going to have a series of tests between an Australian team and an English team. We're going to call them the victory tests. And it's a celebration of the war being over, but also of getting cricket back and happening and returning to normal. A bit like, you get this sense of we want life to get back to normal as fast as possible. And these tests in which Keith will play will make Miller's name both in England and Australia when we return.
I cannot wait. This is just a great story, a great energy, a larger-than-life character. It's on a big stage. He's just remarkable. I cannot wait to see where this is going. Thank you, Titus O'Reilly.